It all started when I decided to move out of my parents' house and find a place of my own. I'm a pretty quiet guy, not the type to go out partying or anything, so I thought finding a decent roommate wouldn't be too hard. After some searching online, I came across an ad from a guy named Kyle who was looking for someone to share his apartment. The rent was cheap, the location was close to my job, and Kyle seemed pretty normal when we met up to talk about the place. So I figured, why not? The apartment was a small 2-bedroom place in a quiet part of town. It wasn't anything special, but it was clean and Kyle seemed like a chill guy. He was about my age, maybe a little older, and worked as an accountant or something like that. At first everything seemed fine. We'd make small talk in the living room, watch some TV together, and occasionally grab a beer. He wasn't the type to throw parties or have a bunch of people over, which suited me just fine. I thought I had lucked out. But after a few weeks, I started noticing little things about Kyle that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't anything major at first, just odd behaviors that I brushed off because I didn't want to be paranoid. Sometimes I'd catch him just standing in the hallway late at night facing the wall like he was deep in thought or something. He wouldn't say anything, just stand there in the dark. When I asked him if everything was all right, he'd give me this weird smile and say, "Yeah, just thinking." I told myself he was probably just a weird guy, no big deal, but it still made me uneasy. One night, I was up late in my room watching TV when I heard a noise outside my door. It sounded like soft footsteps, like someone was pacing back and forth. I opened the door and there was Kyle, standing in the hallway again, just staring at me. This time his eyes looked different, wide, almost like he hadn't blinked in a while. I tried to laugh it off, asking him what he was doing, but he just kept staring. Then he finally said, "Just making sure you're still here." I didn't know what to say, so I mumbled something about going back to bed. He didn't move right away, but after a few seconds he walked back to his room without saying anything else. I closed my door and locked it. I remember lying in bed that night feeling more on edge than I had since I moved in. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off with Kyle. Over the next few days, Kyle started acting even stranger. He wasn't as talkative as before, and when we did talk he'd make these weird comments that made me uncomfortable. Like once I was making dinner, and he came into the kitchen and said, "You ever wonder what it feels like to just snap?" I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just laughed awkwardly and said, not really, man." He gave me that twisted grin again and said, "Yeah, me neither." That night I couldn't sleep. Every little noise in the apartment made me jump. I kept thinking about Kyle's question and the way he had been looking at me lately. I even started thinking about looking for a new place to live, but I kept telling myself I was overreacting. I didn't want to seem paranoid or anything, and finding a new place would be a hassle. I figured if things got worse, I'd leave, but for now, I'd stick it out. A few nights later, things escalated. I was woken up by this loud crashing sound coming from Kyle's room. It sounded like someone was throwing furniture around. I jumped out of bed and ran to his door, pounding on it, asking if he was okay. There was no answer, just more crashing and what sounded like heavy breathing. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to just leave the apartment and call the cops, but I didn't want to cause a scene if it was just a freak out or something. After what felt like forever, the noise stopped. I stood there frozen, my heart racing, then the door slowly opened, and Kyle was standing there covered in sweat, his hair all messed up. The room behind him was a disaster. Furniture was overturned, papers were scattered everywhere, and there were marks on the walls like he had been punching them. He looked at me with that same wide-eyed stare, but this time his grin was gone. He just looked empty. "Everything's fine," he said in this flat, monotone voice. "Just had a bad night." I didn't say anything. I just backed away slowly, went to my room, and locked the door. My hands were shaking as I sat on the edge of my bed, trying to figure out what to do. I knew I couldn't stay there anymore. Something was seriously wrong with Kyle, and I didn't want to be around when whatever was going on with him got worse. The next morning, I packed up as much of my stuff as I could and told Kyle I was moving out. I tried to act casual about it, saying I had found a place closer to work, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He just stood there in the living room, staring at me with that blank expression. He didn't say a word. As I walked out the door, I could feel his eyes on me the whole time. I crashed on a friend's couch for a few days while I looked for a new place. I tried to put the whole thing behind me, telling myself that Kyle was just going through something and it wasn't my problem anymore. But then, a few weeks after I moved out, I saw something on the news that made my stomach drop. Kyle had been arrested for attacking a co-worker at his job. According to the report, he had snapped during a meeting and violently assaulted the guy, sending him to the hospital. They showed a picture of Kyle, and he had that same wide-eyed look like he wasn't all there. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if I had stayed in that apartment with him. All the weird things he had said and done suddenly made sense. He was unraveling, and I had been living with him while it happened. I'm not a superstitious guy, but sometimes I think there was something darker going on with Kyle, something I can't really explain. I don't know if it was just a mental breakdown or if there was something more sinister at play, but either way, I'm glad I got out when I did. Looking back, I wish I had trusted my instincts earlier. If you ever feel like something's off with someone, don't just brush it off like I did. Sometimes, those little red flags can turn into something a lot worse. I haven't heard anything about Kyle since then, and honestly, I hope I never do. I had just moved to a new city for a job, and I needed a place to live. I didn't know anyone in the area, so I started looking for roommates online. After scrolling through tons of ads, I came across Jake's post. He seemed normal enough, a few years older than me, and had a decent apartment in a part of town I could afford. We met for coffee, and he seemed pretty chill. Nothing weird or off about him. So, I moved in. At first, everything was fine. Jake worked a lot, so I didn't see him much during the day. When he was home, we'd watch TV together or have a few beers. We didn't really get into personal stuff, though. He never mentioned his family or friends, and I didn't press him on it. I figured we were just two dudes sharing a space. After about a month, little things started happening around the apartment. At first, it was stuff I just brushed off. You know how you sometimes misplace things and then they turn up somewhere you're sure you didn't leave them? It was like that. I'd leave my phone on the kitchen counter and later I'd find it on the coffee table. Or I'd leave my keys on the hook by the door and they'd end up on the bathroom sink. I didn't think much of it at the time, just figured I was being forgetful because of work stress or whatever. Then, I started hearing footsteps at night. Our apartment had hardwood floors, so you could hear every creak and thud when someone walked around. Sometimes late at night I'd hear footsteps coming from the living room or the hallway. I'd get up to check, but no one was ever there. Jake was usually asleep by then, or at least, that's what I thought. I told myself it was just the building settling or maybe neighbors in the apartment above us. But the footsteps kept happening, and then they got louder. One night I heard them clear as day, heavy, deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth in the hallway right outside my door. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, listening. They stopped for a moment, and then I heard a soft knock on my door. It wasn't Jake's usual knock, it was lighter, almost hesitant. I called out, "Jake?" But there was no answer. I waited, and after a minute I got up and opened the door. The hallway was empty, and Jake's door was shut. Then one day, I found something that really freaked me out. I came home from work, and Jake wasn't there yet. I was getting ready to head out to meet some friends when I noticed a picture frame on the shelf in the living room. It was a small frame, one of those cheap ones you can get at any store. I hadn't seen it before, and I got curious, so I picked it up to look at it. Inside the frame was a photo of Jake and a woman. They were standing close together, smiling at the camera like they were a couple. But that wasn't the part that freaked me out. The woman in the photo was my ex-girlfriend, Sarah. I hadn't seen or spoken to her in over a year, and as far as I knew, she didn't know anyone in this city. There was no way Jake should have known about her. I felt this chill run down my spine. I stood there staring at the photo, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it wasn't her. Maybe it was just someone who looked like her. But no, it was definitely her. I'd know that face anywhere. When Jake got home later, I confronted him about it. I asked him who the woman in the photo was, trying to keep my voice calm. He looked at me with this blank expression and said, "Oh, that's just an old friend." I pressed him on it, asking how he knew her, but he wouldn't give me a straight answer. He kept dodging the question, changing the subject. I was starting to get really pissed off, but I didn't want to push him too hard. There was something about the way he was acting that made me uneasy, like he was hiding something. After that, things got worse. The weird little things around the apartment kept happening. I'd come home and find my stuff moved around like someone had been in my room. I started locking my door at night, but I still heard the footsteps in the hallway. Sometimes I'd hear whispering too, just faint enough that I couldn't make out what was being said. One night I overheard Jake talking on the phone. I was in my room with the door cracked open, and I heard his voice coming from the living room. He was talking quietly, like he didn't want anyone to hear him. I couldn't make out everything he said, but I caught a few words. He doesn't know. It's almost time. Don't worry. My stomach dropped. I had no idea what he was talking about, but it sounded bad, like really bad. I couldn't stay there anymore. I decided I had to leave, but I didn't want Jake to know. I started packing my stuff little by little, hiding some of it in my car whenever Jake wasn't around. I didn't want to tip him off. The night before I left, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that photo of Sarah and Jake, about the footsteps, the whispers, the weird phone calls. I lay there in bed, wide awake, listening for any sound. Around 2 a.m., I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were different. They weren't in the hallway, they were right outside my bedroom door. The floor creaked and then I heard breathing, heavy, slow breathing. I held my breath, waiting, my heart pounding so loud I was sure Jake could hear it. The doorknob rattled like someone was trying to turn it. I stayed completely still, not daring to move. After a few seconds, the doorknob stopped rattling, and everything went quiet. I lay there for what felt like hours, too scared to get up and check. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep, but it was that kind of half-sleep, where you're still sort of aware of what's going on around you. As soon as it was light outside, I grabbed the rest of my stuff and bolted. I didn't even look at Jake before I left. I just grabbed my keys and got the hell out of there. I never went back. I blocked Jake's number and found a new place to live. I don't know what he was up to, and honestly I don't want to know. I never told Sarah about the photo either. I didn't want to drag her into whatever that was. To this day, I still think about what could have happened if I'd stayed. I don't know who Jake really was or what his deal was, but I'm just glad I got out before I found out. I was looking for a place that wasn't too expensive but also wasn't a total dump. I found an ad online for a guy named Sean who was renting out a room in his 2-bedroom apartment. The rent was decent and the location was close to work, so I figured I'd check it out. When I met Sean, he seemed like a pretty normal guy, a bit quiet, but I just figured he was shy or maybe a little introverted. He told me he worked nights at a warehouse, so I wouldn't see him much during the evenings, and that worked out fine for me since I worked a 9-to-5 job. We chatted for a bit and he seemed nice enough. He told me I could move in as soon as I wanted, so I did. For the first couple of weeks everything was pretty normal. We didn't hang out much, but that was fine with me. He'd come home from work late and I'd be asleep most of the time, so we didn't cross paths often. Sometimes we'd bump into each other in the kitchen or the living room and we'd have a quick conversation, mostly small talk. I didn't think much of it. Then things started to change. It began with little stuff I didn't think much of at first. Sean started spending more and more time in his room, like, way more than usual. I'd hear him come home from work and go straight into his room, and then I wouldn't hear from him for days. No TV, no music, nothing. He'd just stay in there, and I figured maybe he was just tired from work and wanted some privacy. No big deal, right? But then there were times when I didn't hear him at all. I'd go a whole weekend without seeing him, and I started to wonder if something was up. I thought maybe he was going out during the day while I was at work or something, but I wasn't sure. One night I came home late after hanging out with some friends and I noticed a weird smell in the apartment. It wasn't super strong, but it was enough to make me stop and notice. It was kind of like a musty, rotten smell, like old garbage or something. I checked the trash, thinking maybe we'd left something in there too long, but it was empty. The smell seemed to be coming from Sean's room. I stood outside his door for a minute, but I didn't knock. It felt awkward, like I didn't want to intrude on his space, so I just left it alone and went to bed. Over the next few days, the smell got worse. Every time I walked past Sean's room, I'd catch a whiff of it, and it was starting to make the whole apartment stink. I was trying to figure out how to bring it up to him without sounding like a jerk. I mean, I didn't want to be that guy who complains about every little thing, but it was getting pretty bad. Then one morning, I woke up and realized I hadn't seen Sean in almost a week. His door was closed, like always, but I hadn't heard him come or go in days. I started to worry. What if something had happened to him in there? What if he was sick or worse? I knocked on his door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. I called his name. "Sean, you okay in there?" But there was just silence. I felt this tight feeling in my chest, like something wasn't right, but I couldn't just break down his door. I thought about calling the cops, but what was I supposed to tell them? "Hey, my roommate's been in his room for a few days and it smells bad." It sounded ridiculous. I decided to give it another day. Maybe he was just really tired or something. Maybe he'd come out on his own. But that night things got worse. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, but I kept hearing these weird noises coming from Sean's room. At first, I thought I was just imagining it, but then I heard it again. It was like a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, listening closely. The sound came and went, and then everything went quiet again. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that maybe he was just moving some furniture around or something, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was really off. The next day I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I was going to knock on his door again, and if he didn't answer, I was going to call someone for help. I knocked hard this time, practically pounding on the door. "Sean, are you in there? Are you okay?" Still nothing. That's when I made the decision to open the door. I know it was a violation of privacy, but I couldn't just ignore it anymore. I grabbed a bobby pin and tried to pick the lock, something I'd learned from YouTube videos a while back. After a few tries, the door finally clicked open. I wish I hadn't opened it. The room was a disaster. It looked like someone had gone through and trashed the place. Clothes and papers were scattered everywhere, furniture was overturned, and there was this giant dark stain on the carpet in the middle of the room. The smell hit me like a punch to the face, stronger than before, like something had been rotting in there for days. But the worst part? Sean was gone. Nowhere to be seen. I stood there frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. Where the hell was he? I didn't know what to do. I backed out of the room, closing the door behind me, and just sat on the couch for a while, trying to figure out what had just happened. Should I call the police? Should I try to clean up the mess? My mind was racing and I felt sick to my stomach. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the state of Sean's room and that awful smell. I kept hearing those weird noises too. Soft scraping sounds like something moving around in his room. But I knew he wasn't in there. I had checked. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The next day, I called the building manager and told him that Sean had disappeared and that his room was trashed. The manager seemed annoyed more than anything and said he'd send someone to check it out, but he didn't sound like he was in any hurry to do so. I guess people go missing all the time in the city, but this felt different. As the days went by, I kept hearing those noises. It didn't make any sense, but they were there. Soft, faint sounds coming from Sean's room. I even checked the room a few times, but it was always empty. The stain on the carpet was still there, and the smell, while not as strong, lingered in the air like something that wouldn't go away. One night I came home late from work, and I swear I heard someone whispering in the apartment. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I quickly checked the apartment, but no one was there. Just me, alone, and that damn smell. I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed up my stuff and moved out as fast as I could. I didn't care about the lease or the deposit, I just wanted to get away from that place. I left everything behind, including my furniture and some of my clothes. I just didn't want anything that had been in that apartment with me. It's been a few months since I left, and I'm still trying to make sense of what happened. I've tried looking up Sean online, but I haven't found anything. No social media, no records, nothing. It's like he just vanished. I've even driven by the old apartment building a few times, but I haven't had the nerve to go back inside. I don't know what was going on in that apartment, but I know one thing. I'll never live with a roommate again. Every time I think about Sean, I get this uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. I keep wondering what that stain was, what that smell was, and what the hell was making those noises. Maybe I'll never know, but honestly, I think I'm better off not knowing. Some things are better left unexplained, at least that's what I keep telling myself. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed in my new apartment, I swear I still hear those faint scraping sounds, like something moving just out of sight, just beyond the walls. And every time I do, I wonder if Sean ever really left at all.